أعوذ بالله السميع العليم من الشيطان الرجيم بسم الله الرحمن الرحيم الحمد لله رب العالمين والصلاة والسلام على أشرف الأنبياء والمرسلين سيدنا محمد وعلى آله أصحابه أجمعين. My dear respected brothers and sisters, Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh. I hope you've had lunch and hopefully you're well settled in, inshallah, as we get the convention started. The topic before me, and I want to be clear at the end, just at the beginning, just so that by the end, if I get too passionate, it seems like I wasn't. I'm very optimistic about the issues of race and indeed racial harmony within the Muslim community. So what I'm about to say is going to set this tone, the stage, if you will, for personal and professional experiences in trying to address this. But again, if I don't end by the end, if I don't still sound optimistic, I want to make sure at the beginning I say that alhamdulillah things are improving, but we still have a long way to go. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in the Quran addresses mankind in different ways. To the believers, Ya ayyuhalladhina amanu, those verses are very specific. Sometimes they have a commandment in terms of what we're expected to do within the faith. Other times, the verses are addressed to all of humanity. Ya ayyuhan nas. And those verses, I think, are critical for us as Muslims to not overlook and to assume that maybe those verses are for all of the other people who are not Muslim. That's not the case. Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala in this particular verse relevant to our discussion today addresses all of humanity by saying, Ya ayyuhan nas, inna khalaqnakum min dhakarin wa untha, wa ja'alnakum shu'uban wa qaba'ila lita'arafu, inna akramakum indallahi atqakum. That in addressing all of humanity, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala says, O mankind, or O humanity, be aware that indeed your Lord has created you from a male and a female, and divided you into nations and tribes, lita'arafu, so that you may know one another. Inna akramakum, those who are most noble in the sight of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala are those who have achieved God consciousness. So the hopeful part is that even if you began the verse as a part of humanity at large, and then you understood and came to realize that all of this racial, ethnic, national diversity that we have, all of it is not intended to divide us. Rather, it is intended to bring us together so that we may know one another. Ta'aruf in Arabic has so many different levels of getting to know one another. And then to make sure that even if shaitan was to enter into our imagination, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala ends that verse by saying that indeed no, the most noble of you in the sight of Allah is not one of those tribes, is not one of those genders, because He had said, we created you from a male and a female. Neither gender, no, is not superior, nor is it a particular nation or a tribe. That seems to be a good place to end. That would be a natural place to say, well, if we know that, really what is the problem? The reality is that within Islam, and right from the beginning, with the revelation and the companions listening to the revelation, many of them had to overcome this notion of superiority that is ultimately racially based, if not tribally based, and even to the extent of saying that the Prophet, peace be upon him, saying in this last khutbah, which we don't have time to go through, but you can revisit it, is to say essentially and specifically that no Arab is superior to a non-Arab, just to make sure that at the end of his entire life, nobody had misunderstood what he had come, the message he had come to give. So where are we within the American context? We begin by first understanding that within the US context, even to this day, broadly speaking, race is clearly a determining factor for the socioeconomic structure, the way society is set up. It is clearly there. It has been there since the founding fathers, if you will, as enlightened as they were, literally called black human beings. In fact, 3/5 of a human being. So black people at the founding of our nation were actually called or referred to as 3/5 in our founding documents. not in a passing note that someone said, oh, I hate these people, they're only three. No, in the actual founding documents, as 3/5 of a human being. So we came into a nation, and indeed we have been since the founding of the nation, because as you know, over 20%, nearly 20% of the slaves that were brought to America were actually Muslims. So we have been here since the founding. We came into the founding of the country basically dealing with racism. Our African American ancestors, if you will, who were Muslim, dealing with racism, being treated as less than a human being, second-class citizen, if you will. And then you fast forward and you get to the 19th century. You get to the Civil War. You get to the freeing of the slaves in 1864-65. And then you fast forward another century to 1965. So let me talk about 1965, and then in the American historical context, and then we'll talk about why we're still having problems. Until 1965, African Americans lived a segregated life. The white water fountain and the black water fountain. If you came to a restaurant, you were not going to be served at the front of the restaurant. There was a side entrance or a back entrance. If you intended to eat in that restaurant, it was impossible for you. There were homes, or at least almost like a style of home that was only available to you. And the place you lived was often, and it's always railroad tracks and rivers that separated communities racially. You lived on that side of the railroad tracks or that side of the river. As immigrants, and I'm a son of immigrants, if we don't know this history, we tend to repeat it in ways that are unimaginable. So immigrants could not come into the US, those who were not from northwestern Europe. Most people who came were from England, France, Germany, Spain, some parts of Italy, if you will. But ultimately, even when we wanted as a nation to allow immigrants to come, in the 1920s, legislation was set up to make sure that our Asian African ancestors could never come, because there was racist quotas in place. They were there to ensure that we would never be able to immigrate legally, successfully to the US. But in 1965, the Immigration and Nationality Act, if you will, reformed all of that. It got rid of racial quotas. Why? Because by the time the civil rights movement had blossomed, the nation's conscience had been pricked, and people realized we can't continue. That's the benevolent explanation. We can't continue to be a racist society. We have to let people come in from everywhere. The more practical explanation is there was such a massive need for intellectual power in engineering, in the natural sciences, hard sciences, that literally we went out and tried to get people from all over the world to come, and so the laws had to be reformed. So when we entered in the country in 1965, we went immediately almost to the suburbs, while majority of the African American community, owing to the sociocultural and structural forces of racism, were never allowed anywhere near the suburbs. We got jobs in places they were never even able to enter for employment. We got education in institutions where they were not allowed to even study. So if we talk about how we are divided by race today in our masajid, in our communities, without realizing this historical backdrop, it almost seems like we're being idealistic and trying to change something that we ourselves benefited from, which means we benefited from that racist system. We filled the void of employment and of education when our African American brothers and sisters were being structurally kept down. So if you look at society now, most of the masajids that were built, if you will, by this immigrant migration in 60s actually ended up doing what? It ended up creating a structure, replicating a structure of suburban Muslims and mostly inner city Muslims. And that structure is something we have to begin to break down. We have to be able to look at ourselves and say, how come African Americans are not reflected in our communities, in our boards? Not a token where you say, I have a seat available for a black man or a black woman, not in that way, but in a more meaningful way that says, how is it that I got to where I am in this racist society and I left behind people who, because of their fighting in the civil rights movement, whose really sacrifices, the laws were transformed and I was able to come into the country. So if we want to be, again, optimistic in what to do and what are the dangers, on the one hand, the danger is that we will pass this along to our children. My wife and I are raising 4 children of our own. And we know that there is racism in the community, even forget just the black and immigrant communities, but communities across in terms of race, color of skin. I am of Indian descent, my wife is of Egyptian descent. And so our children have ranges of colors. Allah has blessed them and made them beautiful. But we understand comments that are made to our children, sometimes in front of us, emanate from a complete, hopefully, misunderstanding of Islam. And at worst, racist attitudes, things like, you are dark like your father, and the other one is light like his mother. To young children, this is painful. This is very painful because they don't understand, why are you specifying the shade of my skin? What does that mean? Built into it, internalized, potentially in a subconscious way, is that white or lighter is superior and dark or black is inferior. Not from our faith. This is not from our faith. Indeed, Bilal al-Habashi radiallahu ta'ala anhu, when he came into a situation whereby one of the companions, and for the sake of time I won't go into it but just refer you back to it, referred to him as, "O you son of a black woman," the Prophet, peace be upon him, reminded him that indeed this was a sign that you still had signs of ignorance in you. We've come such a long way. We have so much hope in terms of what we can accomplish. Practically speaking, there are a few things we can and must do. Number one, we cannot sit in situations where jokes are being made, comments are being made, or words are being spoken or actions taken that actually denigrate certain races of people. We cannot any longer sit quietly. We can't. If we do, we're basically saying to those people, it's okay. I'm uncomfortable inside, I'm dying inside from what you're saying, but I won't say anything, it's okay. If we start to change that rhetoric, that dialogue, elevate the civility among us, hopefully somebody will start to say, hey, that's just unacceptable on any level to use racist terminology to refer to one another. Number two, we have to get to know the other races, predominantly among which is the African American race, our brothers and sisters in Islam, who have done and taken so much abuse from us. Sometimes unconsciously, we have done and said things racist, and sometimes even worse, we have done it consciously. We have never apologized, they have never become angry and called us out publicly for it. It's time that we ask ourselves, where in my life are those people because of whose sacrifices I am actually able to live as an immigrant in a divided America? How do I get to know them? If I know them, do I know them well enough to include them in my inner circles? Those dinner parties where our children can interact with one another. So when it comes time for business, transactions, for marriage, things that we consider so intimate for us, it would be a natural instinct to say, this has nothing to do with race. I trust you. I love you for the sake of Allah. I'm not affected by the racist society around me because I'm a Muslim. Last but not least, we have to make dua. It has become very obvious that this last election cycle has unleashed a hidden or just below the surface white supremacist strain that has been there all along. That strain, that white supremacist rhetoric and terror is not going to stop or be directed only at black people or African Americans where it initially started. It's going to come against all of us. And it would be really, really tragic if we thought somehow, because we had lived in the suburbs, we would be unaffected by that terror. No, we will be affected by that terror. We are already being affected by that terror. And you and I have to make dua to Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala that indeed our children and us can rise and aspire to be people who are God conscious, have that taqwa, and then get closer to Allah through that, and not based on our race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, or education. So we close by asking Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala to indeed protect all of us from this racist attitude, and indeed help us to become vanguards of that Islamic spirit which unites people above and beyond race and ethnicity and indeed socioeconomic status. Jazakumullahu khairan. Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi ta'ala wa barakatuh.